The manufacturing plant on the outskirts of the small Midwestern town had been a cornerstone of the community for as long as anyone could remember. For veterans like Tom Harris, it wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. After returning from military service, Tom found stability and purpose working at the plant, alongside dozens of other veterans who had built lives and families around their steady paychecks. The plant symbolized resilience, a place where hard work and loyalty were rewarded. But everything changed one cold autumn morning when Tom and his co-workers were summoned to the break room for a meeting. The somber expression on the plant manager's face hinted at bad news before he even spoke. Due to financial challenges and restructuring, we're being forced to lay off a significant portion of our workforce, the manager announced, his voice void of emotion. Tom's heart sank as he scanned the room, seeing the shock and despair mirrored on the faces of his fellow workers. His name, along with several others, was on the layoff list. At first, Tom believed the layoffs were simply a result of hard times. But when he returned to the plant to collect his belongings, he noticed a group of new hires entering the building, young, unfamiliar faces speaking in Spanish as they navigated their new roles. Rumors spread quickly. The plant was replacing longtime employees, many of them veterans, with Mexican immigrants willing to work for lower wages. The news hit Tom hard. For years, he had prided himself on his work ethic and loyalty, believing those values would secure his future. Now, it felt like those qualities meant nothing. The layoffs weren't just about losing a paycheck. They were a blow to his identity and the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow veterans. The town soon became a hotbed of tension. At the local diner, conversations turned heated as residents debated the changing workforce. "It's not fair," one veteran said, slamming his coffee cup onto the counter. "We fought for this country, and now we're being pushed aside." Others, however, urged understanding. "They're just trying to survive, like the rest of us," argued a local school teacher. "Blame the company, not the workers." For Tom, the situation was deeply personal. As he struggled to find new employment, bitterness grew within him. The narrative was clear in his mind. The jobs that had supported veterans for decades were being taken by people who hadn't earned them. What he didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about loyalty, fairness, and survival. Tom Harris sat in the dimly lit VFW hall, the bitter aroma of stale coffee lingering in the air as his fellow veterans discussed the layoffs. Their voices echoed with frustration, anger, and confusion. For years, the manufacturing plant had been more than a job. It was a bond they all shared, a reminder of the discipline and camaraderie they'd known in service. Now, that bond was unraveling, replaced by a gnawing sense of betrayal. "This isn't right," said Jack, a Vietnam veteran who had worked at the plant even longer than Tom. "We built that place, we kept it running, and now they're tossing us aside for cheap labor." Tom nodded in agreement. "I don't have anything against immigrants," he said, his voice steady but filled with frustration. "But it feels like we're being pushed out, like our years of service don't mean anything anymore." The room murmured in agreement, yet beneath their shared anger was an undercurrent of helplessness. What could they do? The plant was a private business, and its management seemed more concerned with cutting costs than honoring loyalty. The new workforce. The next week, Tom reluctantly took a job at a nearby warehouse. It wasn't the steady, well-paying work he was used to, but it kept food on the table. To his dismay, the warehouse was staffed primarily by the same demographic now filling the positions at his former plant, Mexican immigrants. Tom found himself working alongside Carlos Rivera, a man in his early 30s with a quiet demeanor and a strong work ethic. Carlos kept to himself at first, aware of the tension between himself and the veterans who had also taken jobs at the warehouse. But as the days passed, he began to engage with Tom, offering a polite "good morning" or a helping hand when a heavy load needed lifting. Tom's initial resentment simmered beneath the surface. He couldn't help but see Carlos and his peers as part of the problem. "These guys don't understand what we've been through," he muttered to Jack one afternoon during their lunch break. "They just show up and take whatever they can get." But over time, cracks began to form in Tom's perspective. One evening, as they worked late to meet a shipment deadline, Carlos struck up a conversation. "You're a veteran, right?" Carlos asked, glancing at the faded patches on Tom's work jacket. Tom nodded. "Army, served in Iraq. You?" Carlos shook his head. No military, but my father was. He fought in Mexico against the cartels. It's why we came here. Safer for my family. Tom was caught off guard. He hadn't expected Carlos to have a story of sacrifice and resilience, much like his own. Clashing perspectives. Despite the growing rapport between Tom and Carlos, tensions at the warehouse remained high. One afternoon, a heated argument broke out between a group of veterans and immigrant workers over who deserved better shifts. "You don't even belong here," shouted one veteran, his voice tinged with bitterness. "We fought for this country. We earned these jobs." Carlos stepped forward, his normally calm expression tight with frustration. "And we're trying to build lives here," he said. "We're not your enemies." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Tom, standing off to the side, felt torn. He understood the frustration of his fellow veterans, but he couldn't ignore the truth in Carlos's words. They weren't the enemy. The system that pitted them against each other was. Uncovering the truth. Tom's perspective began to shift further when he attended a town hall meeting organized by local activists to address the layoffs at the plant. The event was packed with laid-off workers, concerned residents, and community leaders. A local journalist presented data showing how the company had systematically replaced long-term employees with lower-wage workers, many of whom were immigrants, to maximize profits. "This isn't about veterans versus immigrants," the journalist explained. "It's about a system that values profits over people, no matter who they are." Tom listened intently, the pieces falling into place. He realized that the anger he and his fellow veterans felt was justified, but it had been misdirected. The real issue wasn't the immigrants, it was the corporate policies that exploited both groups. Building bridges. The next day, Tom approached Carlos during a break. "I've been thinking about what you said," Tom admitted, "about how we're not enemies. I think you're right." Carlos smiled faintly. "It's hard, though. When there's not enough to go around, everyone fights for scraps." "Doesn't have to be that way," Tom said. "What if we worked together, veterans and immigrants? Maybe we'd get further if we stopped fighting each other and started fighting the system." Carlos nodded slowly. "It's worth a shot." Together, Tom and Carlos began talking to their co-workers, sharing their stories and finding common ground. They discovered that both groups faced similar struggles: low wages, unsafe working conditions, and a lack of job security. The conversations were tense at times, but gradually, walls began to come down. Taking action. Tom and Carlos decided to organize a meeting between the veterans and immigrant workers. They rented a space at the community center and invited anyone affected by the layoffs or poor working conditions to attend. At the meeting, Carlos shared his journey from Mexico, explaining the sacrifices his family had made to escape violence and start anew. Tom, in turn, spoke about his military service and the difficulties of transitioning to civilian life. Their stories resonated with the audience, fostering a sense of unity. "We're all being treated like we're disposable," Tom said, his voice steady but firm. "But we're not. We're workers, we're people, and we deserve better." The meeting ended with a commitment to form a workers' coalition, uniting veterans and immigrants to advocate for fair wages and improved conditions. The group began drafting letters to local officials and planning a rally to draw attention to their cause. A glimmer of change. As the coalition gained momentum, the manufacturing plant faced mounting pressure. Media coverage of the workers' stories, coupled with the growing support from the community, forced the company to address the grievances. While they didn't reinstate all the veterans, they agreed to rehire some and implement better protections for current employees, including the immigrant workforce. Tom and Carlos stood side by side at the rally, watching as their co-workers, once divided by resentment, marched together in solidarity. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. The autumn air was crisp as Tom Harris stood on the steps of the community center, addressing a crowd of workers, neighbors, and supporters. The rally had grown beyond anything he or Carlos Rivera could have imagined. What began as a group of frustrated workers had become a united coalition, one that stood not only for veterans or immigrants, but for fairness and dignity for all. Tom's voice carried over the crowd. "For too long, we've let them divide us, by race, by nationality, by circumstance. But today, we're showing them we're stronger together." The crowd erupted in cheers, their signs waving high. Fair wages for all, united not divided, respect workers' rights. Tom glanced at Carlos, who stood beside him, holding a sign that read, "Every worker counts." They exchanged a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come. A new perspective. The manufacturing plant's management had already begun implementing changes, thanks to the pressure from the coalition and media coverage. Some veterans, including Tom, had been offered their jobs back, while immigrant workers were granted wage increases and safer working conditions. Though the victories were incremental, they represented a step forward. Tom chose not to return to the plant. Instead, he focused on his new role as a community advocate. The experience had opened his eyes to the shared struggles of those around him, and he was determined to keep fighting for systemic change. Carlos and Tom's bond. Carlos approached Tom after the rally, his usual quiet demeanor giving way to a rare smile. "I never thought I'd see something like this," he said, gesturing to the crowd. "It feels like we actually made a difference." "We did," Tom replied, shaking Carlos's hand firmly. "And we'll keep making one." Their unlikely friendship had grown into a partnership, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of perseverance. They represented two sides of the same coin, different experiences, but the same fight for a better life. A united community. The rally ended with a shared meal at the community center, veterans and immigrants sitting side by side, laughing and sharing stories. The tension that once divided them had melted away, replaced by camaraderie and a sense of purpose. Tom watched the scene unfold, feeling a deep sense of pride. He had started this journey filled with anger and resentment, but it had led him to something greater, the realization that unity was the most powerful tool they had. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom leaned against a railing, reflecting on the lessons of the past months. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving forward, together.